الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our 16th session now, where we are reading and reflecting on the work of the great Ottoman scholar Said Nursi in his treatise titled A Message for the Sick or A Message for the Ill. Alhamdulillah, over the past 15 days now, we have been reflecting, we have been analyzing and benefiting from the profound counsels and spiritual remedies that he provides in this text, particularly for those individuals who are suffering from disease and are trying to comprehend and come to terms with this tribulation or trial that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed them with. And as we know, the first or the default response that we usually have to disease is that we go into a state of grief or into a state of despondency, because naturally the burden of disease affects our daily activities, it affects our daily function. When the mobility of a disease is great, it impairs us psychologically. It affects not only us but also those around us, our family, our friends. And then the concept or the experience of physical suffering and pain is something that none of us look forward to, because no one wishes to be in a state of pain or in a state of physical suffering. And when we look at these external consequences or byproducts of disease, it places us in a very difficult or in a very ambiguous situation, because we are not able to really respond appropriately to the disease. It's only when we have the metaphysical or the spiritual insights through the light of faith that we are truly able to have a broader perspective or to have a more holistic understanding of the purposes of disease. And we've discussed this extensively over the past 15 days, the various purposes that Sayyid Nursi alludes to when he speaks about the benefits or the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala afflicting individuals with disease and suffering. And perhaps one of the most profound of these purposes that he mentions is that disease reminds us, it becomes a medium for us to remember our transient natures, and that we will have to leave this temporal abode at some point. So inshallah, today we'll be looking at another spiritual remedy. We'll be looking at the 14th advice that Sayyid Nursi provides in this text. But before we discuss that and reflect upon that, I just wanted to highlight something that I thought is very important and appropriate for our current time. And that is something that has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic that we are all experiencing in some form or in some way. And as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic is caused by a strain of the coronavirus, and as we've all experienced now over the past 1 to 2 months, the damaging consequences of this virus on our health, on our social lives, on the political and economic spheres of the world. And we've seen how all of these spheres of existence have been severely impaired, and because of this, people are suffering tremendously around the world. I'm sure we're all able to identify so many people within our own localities who are going through difficult periods, who are going through a difficult time now in various ways. Some people have been afflicted with disease, some families have lost members of their families, who are the breadwinners, who were responsible for the upkeep of their families due to the COVID-19 disease. Some people have been affected through the economic restrictions and the economic contractions that have occurred in the various national economies. People have lost their jobs. People are struggling to find food. People are struggling to fulfill their daily activities. And so we have all seen now over the past month or two the consequences and the effects of the coronavirus in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic. And whilst we reflect upon that in this physical world, it's important then to ask ourselves about the spiritual viruses or the spiritual maladies which are running rife and rampant within ourselves. Just as we have seen and we have experienced the negative consequences and damaging effects of the COVID-19 virus in the physical world, we should equally analyze and introspect to understand the viruses and the diseases that are so prevalent within ourselves. And just as the coronavirus has caused so much physical pain, grief, and difficulty in the world, we should understand that these spiritual viruses that are occurring within ourselves are causing grief and negative effects within our souls and within our spiritual dimensions. These diseases of kibr, of riya, right, of hasad, and so forth. These are very serious things that we need to take into account. The problem is that because they are not tangible, right, we don't see the physical effects, we tend to neglect them and we tend to abnegate them. And this really ties into the notion that metaphysics has been relegated to nothingness, in the sense that people don't really care about those things which they cannot identify with their senses. And we've spoken about this in the previous sessions. This is a direct result of the materialistic world or the naturalistic world that we live in, and the worldviews that we have adopted that focus on positivism. And as I mentioned, we've discussed this extensively in the previous sessions, but it's just important that we understand the critical nature of identifying and looking at our souls and looking at our nafs and trying to eradicate and to diagnose these spiritual illnesses. That really, if you really want to get down to the crux of many of the problems in the world, it's because of the spiritual diseases within us that have manifested in the physical world. And this is what the great scholars of tasawwuf, the great scholars of spirituality have been speaking about. The likes of Imam al-Ghazali, the likes of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, and others. When you read their works, this is essentially what they focus on, identifying these surreptitious qualities, these blameworthy qualities within ourselves that are causing havoc within us, and then have a negative effect or consequence on our physical worlds, because they ultimately manifest and exude from within us to the external world. So our great scholars of spirituality, they try their best in their works to highlight these points. And if you read the works of Imam al-Ghazali particularly, you see this very evidently in most of his works. The problem, unfortunately, with us is that we have taken his work and the works of others and have made their contributions very academic. So we theorize about what they've said, but we don't implement and actualize the very counsels that they have provided for us. At the same time, when we read their works and we read the negative effects of the blameworthy characteristics or the spiritual maladies of the soul and of the heart, we tend to identify other people. We try to project these maladies onto other people such that we think or that we rather distance ourselves from these maladies in assuming that it's others who are guilty of manifesting these negative qualities, but on ourselves. And then when we read about the praiseworthy qualities that we should imbibe and exude, then we tend to use ourselves as models for that, assuming that we have attained these praiseworthy characteristics. And we forget the fact that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes good for a person, He shows them and He makes it known to them their negative qualities or their shortcomings. And so when we are able to truly come to terms with our spiritual states and the lowly stations or the lowly levels that we have reached due to our nafs and the inclinations of the lowly souls, right? It's now that we are able to truly make an active effort to resist those impulses and to try to adorn or embellish ourselves with the positive qualities that the great spiritual masters have discussed in their works. So inshallah, in this month of Ramadan, during this testing time that we are all going through, let us use this opportunity to see that parallel between the spiritual maladies that exist within ourselves and the physical maladies that are occurring, or the physical effects that are occurring because of the COVID-19 virus. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us, for ultimately this is really what everything comes down to. We need to ensure that before we leave this world, that we are in the best of states, that we have purified ourselves from all those things that have weighed us down, that have caused us to become so infatuated with the pleasures of this world, and have made us heedless of our responsibilities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And everything comes down to this. And so some people say that spiritual or moral rectification is a peripheral activity that Muslims should enact only after they have completed their core responsibilities. I would argue differently. I would say that spirituality, true spirituality, authentic spirituality, connected to the Sharia and connected to the fact that we fulfill our obligations to the Sharia, they are both integrated, right? It's not something that you can separate. So we should take this opportunity now in this blessed month of Ramadan and making an active effort to remove all these spiritual diseases that are within us, such that we may become better individuals and gain in our proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make that a reality for us. To focus now on the 14th remedy that Sayyid Nursi provides in this text. He says, "Oh, one who is afflicted with disease, and particularly one who is afflicted with blindness or a deficit in sight, do not grieve and do not go into a state of despair whilst you are suffering from the fact that you might not be able to see properly and see with physical clarity. Remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will substitute this difficulty that He has placed you with something better in the year after." So essentially what Sayyid Nursi is saying in this specific treatise, and he's focusing on a particular illness or affliction, and that is blindness or partial blindness. He's saying that if you are afflicted with such an impairment, do not grieve, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you something better, or something which will be of more benefit. And the point here is that the benefit will be in abode will be in a dimension which will be more critical for you, and that is in your afterlife. And he gives an example where he says that there was a lady, an elderly lady, who assisted him greatly when he was exiled, and she would assist him, with meals and taking care of his daily tasks. And after some time, she was afflicted with an affliction to her eyesight, and thereafterwards she passed away. And Sayyid Nursi reflected on this very deeply, and he came to the realization that even though she was afflicted with this disease, ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed her in the afterlife from the barzakh to have insight into so many other spiritual realities. So even though she was not able to see during the last few days of her life, and she suffered greatly for that, because she was such a pious individual, she was someone who fulfilled her responsibilities towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and towards other human beings. Sayyid Nursi knew that this affliction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed upon her was not a punishment because of her background and because of her piety. And what he was able to extract from the scenario was that this affliction or disease that Allah placed upon her ultimately became a means for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give her something better in the year after. And so he says that whilst she was not able to see the beauty of the gardens in the village that she was living in, when she passed on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave her that sight that allowed her to see the gardens of paradise, which is eternal. And so these are mechanisms, disease are mechanisms which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses. As we mentioned before, we never really or truly have the holistic picture or the bigger picture for ourselves. So we're not able to understand what is in store for us. Usually we're only focused on this physical world because we are here right now, and we tend not to take into account the afterlife. But Sayyid Nursi advises in this point, in this remedy, that take into account the afterlife, because whatever difficulty you face in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His justice will give you something equal or something better. So it's important that we recognize this, and that we show appreciation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all the bounties and gifts that He has given us. These things such as sight and smell and hearing and all the sensual capacities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, we tend to take it for granted. And as Ibn Abbas says, that you should always be grateful for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you, because firstly, it could have been worse. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have made your trial or tribulation worse. And you see this when you look at others. There are always other people that we can identify or that we can see that are in a worse off situation than ourselves. So that should be the first thing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have made it worse. And then secondly, and this is the point that we'll connect to Sayyid Nursi's counsel here, is that Ibn Abbas says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has afflicted you in your dunya and not your akhirah. Right? So show gratitude for that He has afflicted you in this world and not in your year after, because the reality is that this world will have to end and the year after is eternal. And that if we had a choice, then it is better that we are afflicted in this world. But as we've said, this affliction is not a punishment. This affliction is not something negative. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not acting sadistically to us with these diseases or these afflictions. These are means for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to either purify us or to give us something better in the year after. And we will truly only understand that and appreciate that when we transition into the next realm, and that is the realm of the year after. So inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who are able to bear the trials and tribulations that He has placed upon us. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us better in the year after of those things that we have in this dunya. And particularly if we have suffered or we are going through difficulty, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to substitute our suffering in this world with something far greater and beneficial to ourselves in the year after. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the best in this life and in the year after. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.